Now, I was a martial artist. I practiced for well over a decade. I had my second degree black belt in Taekwondo. I was close to getting my third before I blew out a disc in my back.
Wow, I'm going to be a little more careful around you.
No. But I had two very good instructors, Bob Fujimura, who ended up being an instructor for the U.S. Olympics in Taekwondo,
Wow.
and then a guy named Master Un Sang Ki, who was an 8th degree black belt and had learned personally, been instructed personally from the founder of Taekwondo, General Choi Hun-hee, who invented Taekwondo in 1955. Now here's what happens. He teaches Master Un. Master Un teaches me. Okay, now the way it works in forms in the martial arts, a lot of martial arts that are far older than Taekwondo have been going on for centuries.
Right.
And these forms are passed along from instructor to student, instructor to student, instructor to student for hundreds of years, unchanging. Because it's very important that you keep these forms pure to what was originally given, and it's for the student to perfect their technique and everything about the technique. So when I received that from my instructor, he could say, hey Mike, I'm delivering to you, I'm teaching you what I received from General Che,
Right.
who was the founder of Taekwondo. This isn't centuries, this is 30 years when I'm learning these in, say, 1985. 30 years, or even less, after the originals came about. So I had a really good confidence that I was getting what had originally been invented. And I passed along to my students. I trained several to the black belt level, and I passed along to them what I had received unaltered. You couldn't alter it. So I think that what we are looking at when we're talking about the tradition of Jesus is closer to what we find as passing along the martial arts forms than we are talking about with the game of telephone.
And we were talking the other day, and you were pointing out the great care and accuracy that the New Testament writers took. You were talking about Luke, for instance, the extra efforts he went to in doing his work. Share some of those examples of what he did.
A lot of neat stuff. You know, Craig Keener is a New Testament scholar and expert on this stuff, and he's just completed within the last year a commentary on Acts that's over 7,000 pages long.
Wow.
Now, and he was telling me about a lot of the details in Acts, small, seemingly insignificant details that can be corroborated as being accurate. Really small things. Let me just give you, I mean, he gave me a bunch of them, and he said, this is just a small sampling. And for those interested, you can go to, right now there's a book out, it came out like the mid-1980s by Cullen Hemmer. It's called The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And he's got a couple dozen pages in there of all these little facts that have been corroborated, you know, just little things. Like, one that I like is like a tomboy title. Now, when you, Greek is a lot like other languages, like Latin and German and so forth, where you have, we don't have it in English, but you have nouns that are either masculine, feminine, or neuter. And it has nothing to do with their actual gender. It's just, that's how they've labeled them. So, a house in Greek is a feminine noun. You know, so when you come to the term God, or any noun, Greeks did things a little different. They used what's called an article that many times would precede the noun. It would go with it. So if I were to be talking to you and addressing you, instead of saying, Mike, this is a fun interview, I'd say, the Mike, this is a fun interview. I'd have the article in front of it. The article always agreed with the noun itself. So if you have a masculine noun, say your name, Mike, would be masculine in Greek, then the article that went in front of it would have to agree in gender. It would likewise be masculine. And if it was feminine, like salvation, the word soteria, has a feminine, it's a feminine noun, so it has a feminine article in front of it. Hey, soteria. All right? You always have the agreement there in gender. So when you're talking God, that's a masculine noun. You'd say ha theos. It's a masculine article with a masculine noun. If it's a goddess, it's feminine, so you'd say he thea. All right? When we come to Artemis, the goddess of the Ephesians, we have a tomboy term. Instead of he thea, we have he theos. In other words, it's a feminine article with a masculine noun. Very unique. And you'd say, well, that's weird. We don't find that anywhere else. But it's abundantly documented in inscriptions in Roman Ephesus, where Artemis was the goddess of the Ephesians. So it's like, wow, this is pretty neat. And we find all these kinds of things, like really unique or peculiar titles of city officials and people who were in different places, that Luke got it right, down to just minor details. Or things like in Acts 18, I think it's verse 2, where Luke says that Paul had recently come into Corinth and he met Aquila and Priscilla there because Claudius had recently expelled the Jews from Rome. Wow, and then he moves on. Well, not even Josephus mentions the Jews being expelled from Rome. Josephus, a Jewish historian. But it is mentioned by Suetonius, in the early 2nd century Roman historian, who says, at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. Just one sentence, but it's like, even on the small, insignificant, seemingly insignificant details, Luke gets it right so many times.
Right.
So a lot that could be said about that. It's really a lot of fun to study this stuff.
It really pokes holes in the arguments that these guys were just throwing things together, or that they were just trying to make things up to support their arguments.
Well, let me throw in one other thing I think is even more important than what we're talking about with, say, Luke. You've got, because you could say, even though Luke got it right on many occasions, that doesn't rule out that he might have added things at times. So you'd say, well, you know, how well did he stick to his sources? We can test that against how he used Mark. Most scholars believe that he used Mark, and Luke says that there were others who had written Gospels at this time. So he probably used Mark. So the way that he uses Mark and potentially another hypothetical source called Q, we see that he sticks very closely to it. But there's something that's even more fascinating, and that talks about that gap between when the Gospels were written and when the events actually occurred. And that's back to that oral tradition that was passed on more like martial arts forms than we're talking about with, say, the game of telephone. And what you have with that is we got a perfect example in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And what happens with that is Paul is addressing situations in the church concerning marriage and divorce. And toward the beginning of the chapter, he says, now, what if you're single? He says, look, it's a tough time. People are getting persecuted. Christians are getting persecuted now. So if you're single, my advice to you is stay single. You don't want to have to worry about your spouse. So this isn't a command. It's just my recommendation, my opinion. Then he goes on, he says, for those of you who are married, not I, but the Lord. And what he's saying there is, look, what I'm going to give you here is not my opinion. This is Jesus' tradition. Tradition that was passed along to me, that came from Jesus through his apostles, now to me, and I'm passing it along to you. And he basically says, don't get divorced. You know, that's wrong. But then he goes on and he says, okay, and what if you're married to a non-believer and that non-believer wants to stay married to you? Well, then stay with them. But if they want to leave, you're free to remarry. But when he's introducing that, he says, not the Lord, but I. In other words, this is not something that Jesus touched on during his ministry. And I don't feel the liberty, as some scholars would accuse Paul and others, of making up words of Jesus and attributing to him for authority purposes and given those to the early church when Jesus never really said that, but they would make up these words and give it of Jesus to answer a specific question or a situation that came up. Paul's not doing that. And after that, he says, with this last one, not the Lord, but I, he says, and this is my command, and you are to pass this along to the other churches. So here we see opinion versus Jesus' tradition versus Paul's apostolic commands. And that gets really interesting when you're looking at those kinds of things, because Paul did not take the liberty to change the Jesus tradition. That was not to be altered in any sense.